Okay. So good afternoon. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining this webinar for the launch of our consultation paper on good purchasing practices in cocoa. My name is Claire Biazon-Loyer, and I am the Director of Partnerships at Voice. So Voice is a network of 30 NGOs and trade unions promoting sustainability in the cocoa sector. And before saying more, I have a few housekeeping items to go through. And first, I'd like to make sure that those who need interpretation are all set. So we do have interpreters in French and English today, and we'll have a French speaker later on during the panel. So to activate the interpretation module, you can click on the globe, there's interpretation, and then select English. Pour les francophones, nous avons des interprètes en français. Vous pouvez activer le module d'interprétation en cliquant sur le globe dans la bannière qui se trouve en bas et choisir le canal français. I'll also ask you to keep the Q&A tab for questions to our panelists and use the chat for other comments or questions. So now that we are set, we are really thrilled to launch the paper with all of you today. It has been a 9-month process that included consultations with our members, of course, but also consultations with farmer-based organizations and local civil society organizations in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. So we are excited to share our recommendations with you and contribute to this important debate. I will now turn to our moderator, Stephanie Daniels, who is a Senior Program Director at the Sustainable Food Lab and co-host of the Living Income Community of Practice.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome to everyone on the line. So I just want to say a few words. We have a presentation today and then a panel and then plenty of time for all of your comments and questions. So it's a real pleasure to be moderating this discussion. And as always, looking forward to the sharp and considered approach that the Voice Network brings to their research and advocacy. And today we have a conversation that really builds on and deepens the dialogue around the potential of commercial practices to contribute to farmers earning living income. And I think, as we all know, with any voice consultation paper, this addresses head-on one of the toughest issues facing the cocoa sector, that of fair pricing and purchasing practices in an accessible but regularly researched way. And I think whether you agree with the findings or vehemently object to them, or perhaps agree in principle, but are left scratching your head on how to implement them, I think the discussion today will hopefully shed some light and give you an opportunity to comment and pave the way for deeper bilateral and group conversations with the Voice Network and among the larger community working on living income. So I want to first hand it over to Anthony Fountain, Managing Director of the Voice Network, to give us an overview of the paper. Then we'll turn to a panel of 3 different voices and then open it up to comments. Anthony, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you, Claire, for bringing this meeting to an open. I'm really excited to be here because we're talking about some of the key questions that we've been grappling in the cocoa sector for quite a long time. And it feels that throughout the years, we're getting deeper and deeper down that skin of the onion to the core of some of the problems that we have. Forgive me, my computer did an update this weekend and now it recognizes hand gestures. So you might see these bubbles come once in a while. I am now showing my age. I don't know how to turn it off anymore. So forgive me. That got me way out of my talking flow. So I'll have to get back into it. So it feels like we're getting to the core of the onion of the real problems of what we're talking about. And so I want to take you through this paper that we've been setting up over the past months. Last year, we released a paper called the Living Income Compendium, where we said, guys, we really need to start looking at purchasing practices. And a lot of you guys in the private sector said, okay, but what do you mean? What are you talking about when you're talking about purchasing practices? How should we do this? What should we be looking at? And so we've taken that question seriously. We've come up with what we think are the foundational principles how to do this. Now, you will notice that we're not spelling it out for you in minute detail, because I think that we still need to figure out how a lot of this stuff works. And that means that I think that there's going to be a lot of different ways how to interpret this, but the principles, they do stand. And so we've really been looking at what are the principles to this. So if we could go to the next slide, Claire. What we're trying to do in this paper is we're trying to outline the fact that there are three key imperatives why living income is actually going to become more and more important in everything we do. And that first imperative is a moral imperative, which is something that we've been talking about this for decades now. We should do it. But there's a difference between the things that you should do and the things that you do as a company. And very often, the big difference there is between, is it the right thing to do, or is there a business case to do it? And we think that living income is going to move more and more towards a business imperative, because you're going to actually have to have the farmers that will grow the cocoa for you. They're going to have to want to do this for you. So beyond a moral imperative, there is going to be a business imperative for purchasing practices. But I would say that one step further to that, it actually will become a legal imperative as well. If we look at the changing dynamics particularly in Europe, how sustainability is being viewed, not just as an issue that you could tackle, but as an issue that becomes part of regulatory compliance, when we're talking about the EU deforestation regulation, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, etc. These will actually start requiring you to tackle poverty in a way that will also look at the purchasing practices. Now, before I go into the details of the paper itself, if we can go to the next slide, quite a few people have been asking the question. So we're talking about purchasing practices, we're talking about higher prices. Have you actually followed the news? Do you know what the market is doing? And for those of you that might not be following what the market is doing, is we're hitting some pretty record high prices in cocoa. And when I say pretty record high prices, I mean like all-time high. The world market is very, very high. And most farmers across the world, if they can sell their cocoa at the moment, in most countries, are getting very high prices. The two obvious exceptions being Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, because of the way the market is organized there. Those higher prices will reach farms there a little bit later, if they reach there. But there's some big questions there. But one of the reasons why we're bringing this up is because besides the current anomaly here, and if you could click the slide again there, please, Claire, what we often see is that when the prices are high, it's because of bad harvests. And when the prices are low, it's because of good harvests. And so if you follow the regular market dynamic, in the end, it doesn't really matter to the farmer. He's either going to sell a lot at a low price or a little bit at a high price. And the outcome doesn't make much of a difference. Now, at the moment, we've got a 25% reduction in yields and a 50% increase in price. So that's actually a pretty sweet deal, but it's an anomaly. It's a blip in a much bigger thing. And we actually think that the current anomaly, which is actually having companies saying the prices are too high, our exposure is too big, our risks are too great. Maybe this is a good moment to talk about decommodifying what farmers are getting versus what the market does. And so I think maybe a moment where the market is doing weird stuff is a good moment to look at what the market is doing and whether that is the only tool for delivering price points. So in that context, let's have a deeper look at purchasing practices. Now, we sent a earlier draft of this document to a lot of people in the private sector for feedback, and almost everyone came back with the same response. Let's not only talk about prices, you need to talk about the other things. That's interesting because the other elements that we speak of are the things that we've been speaking of as a cocoa sector for, well, ever since I got in cocoa, which is almost 2 decades ago now. Primarily, we always speak about good agricultural practices. But as we argue in last year's Living Income compendium, those good agricultural practices have a very important role to play, but they need a business case on which they can rest. And that business case is driven by good governance, and by good purchasing practices. So why are we now zooming in on these good purchasing practices? Not because the other elements don't matter. They very much do matter. And in fact, they matter so much that we're even considering a sister publication to this one on purchasing practices to look at the good governance. But why would we have to look at purchasing practices itself? Well, because it has a direct impact on farmers. A lot of the governance, when we're talking about things like supply management, investment in infrastructure, transparency and accountability of government incomes and taxes, rule of law, all of those things are essential, but have medium to long-term effect on the actual household income of farmers. Purchasing practices can have a direct impact, and especially in a time where there is a cost of living crisis, definitely in West Africa. This is very, very key, is we need interventions that don't wait half a generation. We need interventions that can actually make a difference tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, then at least next year. And so the direct impact is one of the reasons why purchasing practices are very important. The second thing is in many of our arguments with industry, very often the argument comes, oh, but we can't directly control this. We can't directly control that. You know, the governments need to play. The market needs to play. It's outside of our control because it's weather. Now, there's one thing that is in the direct control of companies, which is how they are buying the product that they are buying. And so it has a direct impact, but it also has a direct influence. It falls under the direct influence of companies because it is their core business. The sustainability programs, the child labor programs, all of those community development issues that we see are important, but that's not the core business of a cocoa or a chocolate company. Their core business is how they buy and sell the products. And so in their core business, it needs to be sustainable. And it's interesting that the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also state that, yes, there's a hugely important role for governments. And we at Voice are the first to acknowledge that. But the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also state governments don't always do that. And when governments don't always take their responsibility, that is not an excuse for companies to then say, oh, outside of our problem field then. The UN Guiding Principles clearly state that even when governments don't do what they should be doing, companies should. And that's where we come to the core business of companies. Even when governments aren't doing what they should be doing, companies should be doing what they should be doing. Having said all that, we think the governance is an important part as well. And so we'll be looking at how we'll do that again next year. And if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a very short, I think we need to skip the bullet points here. The next slide, in basically one picture, gives you a summary of what this paper is saying. And everything else I'm going to say from this moment onward is an in-depth look into these 3 points. What we think are the 3 core principles of purchasing practices are that companies should pay a fair price, companies should share the risks of the farmers, and companies should be accountable about sharing the risks and paying a fair price. So I want to basically break down the price, the risk, and the accountability part a little bit when I go into depth. So if you look at the next slide, what we see is something called the living income gap. The line at the top, that's the living income. And what farmers are earning is basically the money that you can see stacked up. And there's a gap there. That's what we call the living income gap. And what we think paying a fair price means is that you actually do a calculation so that you figure out how big that gap is, and you pay the money so that you cross that gap. You've heard me say this before probably, but it's not rocket science. If you know that people are not getting enough money, you need to give them more money. But then the question is how do you do that? What are the metrics? What are the principles? How do you bridge that gap? And that's what this paper looks at in a little bit more detail. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a lot of points around the living income reference price where there's a lot of unclarity and where people start using different variables in their calculations, et cetera, et cetera. So what we are arguing for is that this living income reference price needs to be based on, firstly, realistic variables. And that means that you can't say, oh, but that you don't take into account the amount of labor required to do it. If someone's going to have to increase their yield, how much work is it going to take to increase that yield? And that you pay for that as well. They need to be realistic farmers on not, oh, a farm should be twice as big. It's not realistic for a farmer to get a farm twice the size he has right now. It needs to be based on current realities. And then the second bullet point there is that it needs to be based not just on the exceptional outliers, but on the average, on the median farmer. Because living income should not just be something that exceptional farmers earn. Living income should be the daily reality of all farmers. It's not a luxury. It's not something that we should consider some kind of a moonshot. Maybe we'll get there. It should be the starting point for everyone, not a finish line for some kind of super ambitious strategy. So a living income reference price, when calculated, needs to be based on realistic variables and focused on the average, the median farmer. Now, the way most of this is done at the moment is by using premiums. And so if we can go to the next slide, also a lot of the payments, for example, within a fair trade or Tony's Chocolonely living income reference price system, the delivery vehicle they use are the premiums paid at farm gate level. But you've also got your regular sustainability premiums, such as in the fair trade or the rainforest or even in company programs. And there's a problem with a lot of the calculations of these premiums is that the whole premium gets counted to bridge that living income gap. But that's actually not very realistic. And we've done a lot of consultations for this paper with cooperatives, with farmer-based organizations in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire, and we've talked to a lot of people in the field. And the people that are actually working this on the ground at the cooperative say that premium is not a net premium. In fact, just about the entire premium is used for the necessary functioning of the cooperative and for the cost of compliance for the farmer. So there's only a tiny little bit of these premiums that are used to actually bridge the net gap. Now, this is not the case in the Fair Trade Living Income Reference Price System or in the Tony's Open Chain Reference Price System, where they actually calculate that on top. But most standard sustainability premiums are trying to sell the premium 3 times. They're like, to bridge the net income gap, to cover the cost of compliance, and to cover the cost of the cooperatives running. And that simply can't work that way. And so we think that premium payments need to be transparently split in what is the net extra income for the farmer and what are the costs of compliance. And then a whole second set of interventions beside the premiums that we have seen in these arguments are around what we're calling non-purchasing interventions. And so these can be things like payments for environmental services. So let's say you're reforesting part of your land, you're leaving part of the land fallow, you've got other programs that are adding on the environmental aspect. You could have in place non-environmental issues like the cash transfer system that we see Nestlé's Income Accelerator do. These are all great additions, but they're not a substitute for making a calculation around the living income reference price. Now, what they could do is they could reduce the gap, but that still leaves you with the requirement to calculate how much should you be paying for what is left. And so we think these non-purchasing interventions are very important and can be very valuable, but cannot be a substitute of a living income reference price calculation. If you look at the additional interventions that are needed at price, and we'll go to the next point there, there are some major questions that still require further working in. So do you only calculate an average, or do you start calculating around segments? So for example, do you pay a higher living income reference price for those segments that are struggling more? Do you pay a lower living income reference price for those farmers that are already doing well? That's something that can be discovered while we're doing these things. And so I think those are elements that are open for new conversations. I think what's very important is that we need to make sure that there is a gender focus in every intervention we've designed, because if we don't put in place gender specific interventions, what's actually going to happen is that the interventions that help the male farmers, because they receive the interventions, creates an even bigger gap between male and female farmers. And so we're going to need to see a lot more gender-specific interventions, some of which are clearly described in the paper there. There's also questions around what's the role of the trader versus what's the role of the brands and the retailers that often have a further remove from the farmers. So traders often deal directly with the cooperatives. They should be the ones that are paying the price. But brands and retailers are buying the product. And what we're often finding is that traders are saying, look, we can only pay the price that our customers are willing to pay us. And that means that this willingness to pay a living income reference price cannot just rest on the shoulders of the traders and the processors, but it actually has to be something that right down to the retailer level, they have to be willing to pay for. And so therefore that needs to be part of the contractual systems that brands and retailers have with their suppliers as well. And then another point that we're finding around scale is that usually it's the smaller companies that actually have bigger risks that are willing to take more risks off the back of farmers, whereas the really big guys tend to reduce their risks to virtually zero. And that, I think, is something that is highly problematic. And yes, when we look at price, the enabling environment, I'm just going to put it in here as an extra bullet point as well. The enabling environment is key. What we are seeing at the moment, the prices are high because there is not enough supply to meet the demand. And that means over the medium to long term, one of the easiest ways to get to higher prices is by making sure that the producer governments have supply management processes in place. Until they do, companies have individual responsibility on that level. This is as far as price is concerned, but price is not the only element of purchasing practices. Actually, I forgot to do the most important part of of the price, which is our primary asks. What are we concretely asking companies to do? And that's the next slide. 3 things primarily, and that is every company should have a living income reference price calculation. That doesn't mean that they have to do the system that a Fair Trade or a Tony's has done. You can come to your own calculation, provided it's an open and transparent calculation based on realistic variables and average farmers. And then they need to review that price on a regular basis. You can't just do it once and then think, hey, we're done. This will require annual review, but we'll get back to that a little bit in the transparency part as well. And then the secondary ask, which we think is quite important here, is that the income effects of the non-purchasing based interventions, they need to be communicated transparently as well. And the premiums need to be split into what is the net income for the farmers, what is the cost for compliance, and what goes to the cooperatives. So the primary asks are really around how do we deliver this good purchasing practices to farmers. The secondary asks are daily reality problems that we've bumped into that can be improved immediately, but that don't actually per se form the building block of a living income good purchasing practices. Now, the second big block after price is risk. And if you look at the next slide, what you'll see is there are so many risks that farmers actually have to bear. And there's very, very, very few mechanisms that help farmers reduce the risk. And further downstream, traders, brands, retailers, their risks are smaller, and there are a lot of tools to manage those risks, whether that's through insurances, through futures, through hedging, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the key things that we need to do is we need to find a way to address that imbalance. And I think that one of the easiest or one of the most logical ways to address that imbalance is by putting in place long-term contracts so that farmer cooperatives know how much cocoa they're going to be selling for several years in a row. Now, the problem is that once you put in place long-term contracts and you have a power imbalance, which in the cocoa sector we do, whether we like it or not, buyers have more power than the cooperatives. If you tie a cooperative into a long-term contract, you could actually bind them into a structure that is bad for them. And that's why we need to have not just long-term contracts, but these contracts need to be asymmetrical. And that means that these contracts actually give the farmer more rights. So for example, the farmer might even have the right to sell to others He doesn't have to sell to the company with whom they have the contract, but it gives the buyer the more duties. So, for example, if a farmer has a fixed tonnage of a fixed quality, the company has to buy this at a certain price because that is part of the contract. And so I was speaking about this to one of the big traders a while ago, and one of the people from that trading house looked at me at some point and said, "But that would mean we take more risk." And I was like, yes, that is exactly the point. Because when I'm talking to the traders at the moment, specifically the traders, like in the last 2-3 months about the current market situation, they're like, "You don't understand how exposed we are, how high the prices and how big the risks we're taking." I was like, "I think I do, but this is the daily reality for farmers. Every single day, this is the risk they take. And we need to find a way to get the weakest link in the supply chain to bear less risk on this level. So we need to get them to have long-term asymmetrical contracts. But not just that, one of the key issues that we also feel around this is that we need to find ways that contracts are respected a lot more, because there are so many breaches of contract towards farmers on a regular basis. And farmers do not know whether a contract is something that will protect them or not at the moment. And so we need an access to remedy in the contract respecting system, but probably, and this is actually a very quick and easy win, not just an access to remedy system, but there are so many different kinds of contracts that farmers are provided that they are often screwed over by not having signed on page 12. We talk, one of the cooperatives we were speaking to in our consultation said last year we didn't get the premiums on our cocoa because we didn't sign on page 12. And I think that putting in place a standard contract where all the variables are simply on page 1, because once again, it's not very complex when you sell cocoa. The volume, the quality, the price, the date of delivery, maybe 2 or 3 extra variables. That's all that has to be in the contract. So providing standard contracts, specifically in circumstances that are in communities that are largely dealing with issues around literacy and numeracy, having a standard contract where you only have to look at a few key variables would make a lot of sense. So respect the contract and put in place a standard contract. So if we take the primary asks around risks, it's actually very simple. There's 2 primary asks. Let's put in place asymmetric long-term contracts, and let's put in place systems that actually make it obligatory to respect the contract. And then lastly, we come to the point of transparency, because purchasing is often shrouded in secrecy because they are competitive issues, et cetera, et cetera. But it means that it's very hard to keep companies accountable. So when we look at transparency and accountability, how do you make that accountable? And we think that there's a few things that need to happen there. Is companies should develop good purchasing key performance indicators that they report to on an annual basis. We think that indirect sourcing is going to become harder and harder to maintain, also in a new world of regulation where you're going to have to prove that, for example, you're free from deforestation, that you are complying to your due diligence. And so indirect sourcing is going to be very hard within a good purchasing KPI structure. It also means that there's some major questions around data transparency and ownership. And one of the things that I found particularly striking when we were talking and consulting with farmers for the making of this paper is the amount of work farmers are expected to do to support data collection, including having a data collection team coming to a cooperative and the cooperative having to feed and house them for a month, and then the cooperative does not have access and definitely doesn't have ownership to the data afterwards, et cetera. So data transparency here and ownership are very important. Now, within all of these things together, if you add this all up and you're asking individual companies to do this, there could be a lot of cost and complexity. And if you've got 15 different KPI structures, it's going to be very hard to compare apples to oranges here. So we also think that steps on this towards sector-wide reporting on these issues would be great, bearing in mind that this is a pricing issue. And so you're going to have to look at how competition law works with this as well. If we look at the primary asks of transparency is we need companies to publish a time-bound policy around how they are going to do all of the above: fair price, share the risks, and be transparent. And then secondly, report on an annual basis according to responsible purchasing KPIs. And if we take all of this together, and this is where I'm coming into land, if you look at this in short, I can tell you that we've got 3 very simple bullet points. Responsible purchasing practices, the principles of that are: companies should pay a fair price, they should share the risks of farmers, and they need to be accountable for this. And we hope that this will help bring the conversation forward for the sector. How we're going to do that, how we're going to fill that in, all the details, is something that we'll probably spend the next years trying to figure out. But we strongly believe that these principles are the ones that we need to move forward on. A lot more detail and nuance on this in our paper that is online on our website as of right now. Looking forward to debating and discussing these issues with all of you in the sector for a very quite a few years to come still, I think, because we're starting to deal with quite a thorny topic here. So thank you so much. And over to you now, Stephanie.
Thanks, Anthony. Obviously a lot to chew on there. I wonder if we could just quickly, there's one question for you to just quickly respond to before we get to the panel. Suzanne, do you want to unmute and ask your question that you've written around, which I think is a really important one, around if everyone's going to calculate their own living income reference price, how does that make a level playing field? Suzanne, feel free to unmute if you want to.
It might be that Claire needs to change her states to get there, but it would be great if we can do that. So Claire, is there a possibility to put Susanne Boetekes on?
Yeah, let me look for it.
Perfect.
You can talk.
Go ahead, Suzanne. We can't hear you now if you're trying to.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead. Yes.
Good. I have to press all kinds of buttons, so I'm with you, Anthony, on the age thing. Yeah, so you said that every company should indeed have a LERP calculation to be able to know what the gap is in their specific supply chains. You also said it doesn't mean that you have to work with Fairtrade or Tony's, and that companies can do their own calculation. And I wonder how that is going to help create a level playing field, for instance, and also ensure that companies then use the right variables. I am aware of, and you know this, we have, as I work for Fairtrade, we have done a lot of work with Tony Chocolonis in calculating a living income reference price. I know that that particular living income reference price is criticized sometimes also by Voice because of parameters used, but at the same time, we could also say that it is a valid reference price, and you know, if at least you work and work from there, you know, the sky is the limit. So that would be my question: shouldn't we in fact agree to build on what exists and have a certain minimum reference price to create that level playing field and then work from there?
I think it's a really great question. And Suzanne, I think I'd like to say, first off, that at the moment, the Fairtrade / Tony's Open Chain living income reference price is the reference point for how these things work. But I think we are trying to figure out, as a broader sector, how these principles work. And so I think kind of saying one methodology is the only way forward when there are still other ways that can be potentially pursued, right? I'm not thinking of any specific situations here, but it could be that a company finds a different way of approaching things that I think you have to be open for from a evidence-based point of view. But at the moment, to be very clear, it does seem like the Tony's / Fair Trade Living Income Reference Price is the reference to look at, even though we indeed feel that the points around realistic variables and average farmers are not quite correctly taken up into the living income reference price system that Fair Trade and Tony's have. We do think that that's a very interesting kind of, that is the gold standard of how it works at the moment. That could change based on other approaches that might be possible. Not that I'm seeing them happening at the moment yet, but I think that it's important to differentiate between the principle of and a specific way that that's calculated. Although I'm quite happy to see that, you know, several years ago, Tony's and Fairtrade decided to align their two calculations to create more clarity, and we would definitely be for that going forward. So. Yeah.
Great. So I see there's a few other questions, but I would like, if okay with you, Anthony, I'd like to go to the panel first, and we will come back to the questions when you join us a little bit later. We have three wonderful speakers with three very different perspectives. So we have Desiree Adon, who is the administrator of the cooperative Copasa, based in Agboville, which is north of Abidjan, and co-coordinator of the Ivorian Platform for Sustainable Cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire. We have Emily Stone, the CEO and founder of Uncommon Cacao, a trading company. And we have Jordi van Honk, who's the global director for living wage and living income at IDH. So first, Desiree, I want to pass it to you. So as a cooperative in the cocoa sector, you are directly dealing with many of the issues that Anthony talked about. Can you talk to us about the impacts of current purchasing practices on the ground for Copasa, and what do you recognize of the challenges on price and risk that Anthony mentioned? Over to you. And again, reminding everyone that there is translation, and Desiree will speak in French, I believe.
Oui, je vais parler en français, c'est bon?
Oui.
D'accord. Merci bien, merci. C'est Stéphanie, hein? C'est ça?
C'est correct.
Oui.
Ah, d'accord. OK. Merci Anthony. J'ai bien écouté l'exposé. Et je suis effectivement Désiré Adon. Je suis administrateur d'une coopérative. Par ailleurs, je suis co-coordonnateur d'une plateforme, la plateforme Ivoire, avec beaucoup d'intérêt, que je prends la parole cet après-midi. Alors, quel est l'impact des pratiques d'achat sur notre coopérative, donc à travers nous, sur les coopératives généralement? Ce qu'il faut noter, c'est que ce dont nous avons hérité. Voilà, nous sommes arrivés dans le secteur du cacao et nous avons donc trouvé là ce système-là. Ce système est un système qui nous valorise pas, qui ne nous donne pas la parole. C'est un système qui ne nous permet pas de nous exprimer. Donc nous sommes réduits seulement à la production. À la production. Tout ce que nous savons, c'est que quand nous sommes agriculteurs de cacao en Côte d'Ivoire, nous sommes tous scotchés à nos postes radio pour attendre le prix que le gouvernement va fixer. C'est généralement le 1er octobre de chaque année. C'est tout. Le reste, nous ne savons pas. Donc, ce système ne nous permet même pas de dire un mot. Donc, à ce propos, quand on doit être, ce système nous maintient donc dans la pauvreté, nous sommes là et on n'a pas de moyens de réagir. On n'a pas de moyen de réagir. Quand le prix passe, le prix augmente un peu, on acclame, mais après, on se rend compte qu'il est insuffisant. Mais le système, il est tellement complexe que nous, en tant que petit producteur dans une petite plantation de 2 hectares ou 3 hectares dans une forêt quelque part, on n'a pas de mot à dire. Donc, ces pratiques d'achat ne nous arrangent pas vraiment. Ne nous arrangent pas parce que le monde évolue, la vie évolue, le coût de la vie augmente. Mais non. Donc, l'impact, c'est de maintenir nos coopératives. Je vais vous dire quelque chose. Nous, on pense que nous, coopératives, ce système nous maintient même rien que dans le transport. C'est-à-dire que nous ne sommes que des collecteurs. Nous ne faisons que collecter le cacao auprès de nos membres que nous transportons à un acheteur qui est basé dans une ville. C'est tout ce que nous faisons. Et ce système nous empêche, nous les coopératives, de réfléchir à notre développement. On ne peut pas réfléchir à notre développement. On ne peut pas penser comment il faut faire pour que demain, la coopérative puisse évoluer. Parce qu'on n'a pas de pouvoir sur le prix, on ne sait pas comment le prix est fixé. Alors, comment voulez-vous qu'on établisse des budgets prévisionnels? Comment voulez-vous qu'on fasse une comptabilité à long terme? Comment pouvez-vous qu'on élabore un plan d'action? On ne sait pas sur quoi. On n'a rien. Parce qu'on ne sait pas à quel prix on sera mangé. Je ne sais pas, je vais dire ça comme ça. On ne sait pas à quel prix le cacao sera acheté l'année à venir. Donc, l'impact, vous voyez que les coopératives en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est un bon système. On a beaucoup de coopératives, mais on dit que les coopératives n'évoluent pas. Les coopératives sont mal gouvernées. Mais on ne peut rien faire. On ne peut rien faire. Quand la campagne arrive, on attend les financements des multinationales. Quand ils nous donnent de l'argent, on collecte le cacao, on vient leur donner. C'est fini. On ne peut pas se développer. Donc, ces systèmes, ces pratiques d'achat ne permettent pas aux producteurs de bien vivre parce qu'il n'a aucun pouvoir dessus et les coopératives ne peuvent pas se développer. Voici ce que je pourrais dire. Merci.
Thank you, Desiree. So this is, I think, the points you were saying about voice and power is fundamental. I just want to ask you one follow-up question, if I could. Have you had experience, or what do you think about the specific ideas of an asymmetric contract and living income reference prices?
Bien sûr, Stéphanie, on a parlé, j'ai bien écouté Anthony sur les contrats asymétriques à long terme. Et nous pensons que ce sont des pistes, effectivement, des solutions sur lesquelles nous nous inscrivons. Mais aujourd'hui, vous savez, quand le système tel qu'il est mis en place, quand ça arrange les gens, on te dira que c'est bon. Quand ça n'arrange pas, on dira que c'est pas bon. Et les gens ont tellement de pouvoir que finalement, souvent, nous, on ne sait pas où mettre la tête. Donc, signer un contrat à long terme asymétrique serait une bonne chose pour nous. Mais quand on regarde au fond, les gens ne veulent pas de cela parce qu'ils vont te dire qu'ils n'ont pas la maîtrise des rendements. Donc, comme on n'a pas la maîtrise des rendements des différentes plantations, il est difficile de signer un contrat à long terme. Il est difficile de signer un contrat. Bien sûr, on peut s'appuyer sur je vais dire les années passées, hein, n'est-ce pas, d'une coopérative pour essayer de trouver une moyenne, enfin, de trouver une moyenne parlant de quantité sur laquelle on peut signer, on peut donc signer un contrat. Donc, ça, nous pensons que ça peut être intéressant. Autre point aussi, c'est au niveau du prix référentiel. Aujourd'hui, il est clair que le prix que nous, les producteurs, nous avons n'est pas suffisant. Nous, les voies et moyens pour combler cela. Anthony a fait plusieurs propositions à travers les rencontres que nous avons eues ici à Abidjan et certainement dans d'autres pays tels qu'au Ghana. Il a fait plusieurs propositions. Ces propositions, est-ce qu'elles sont réalistes? Est-ce qu'elles sont réalisables? J'ai le document, j'ai parcouru, mais ce sont des pistes, des solutions que nous allons enrichir. Nous allons apporter encore des contributions pour permettre aux producteurs de parvenir à un prix référentiel et à un revenu qui lui permet de vivre. Mais aujourd'hui, tel que les gens font en parlant des primes, c'est pas ça. Ça n'apporte pas grand-chose dans la vie du producteur. Ça n'apporte pas grand-chose dans la vie du producteur. Donc, je ne sais pas si j'ai bien compris ta question, mais Stéphanie, voilà ce que je voulais donner comme réponse.
Yes, yes, and I'm sure there'll be more questions for you, Desiree. Thank you very much. I'd like to now go to you, Emily. So you have founded and run the company Uncommon Cacao, and as I understand, you focus on transparency and fair prices to farmers. Can you talk to us a little bit how have you done it, and how does it relate to the recommendations in the voice paper?
Sure, thank you, Stephanie. So Uncommon Cacao is a specialty cacao trader. We source from around 10,000 smallholder producers across 15 countries, and we supply cocoa to over 300 chocolate makers globally. We are a certified B Corp and a public benefit corporation, and I really started this business out of a recognition of the responsibility and the opportunity for intermediaries to decommoditize the cacao industry and do business differently. So I'm really excited to be here and a part of this panel. Thanks again, Anthony, for all your hard work on this paper and on laying out this, I think, very clear roadmap. We have been publishing annual transparency reports for the last 11 years. We started off reporting on farm gate price and FOB price as exporters at our own operations in Central America, specifically in Belize and Guatemala. And we did this because we wanted to be held accountable for our work to demonstrate a scalable model for decoupling from the commodity market and paying farmers higher prices for better quality. I came from a socially responsible investing background and had very much internalized the motto of what is measured is managed. So it became very clear to me that if we wanted to be able to make any meaningful claims about the work that we were doing with producers, we would have to be fully transparent, not just about sort of the programs that we were running, but actually about the way that we were doing business itself. So we have been collecting data on farm gate price and sharing our own data on FOB prices paid, as well as the price at which we sell cocoa to chocolate makers for now over a decade. We have been working with our partners very closely to collect this data. We've experimented with various tech-enabled solutions to do it, but have found that the hardware is a constant struggle. I'd be happy to talk more about sort of the on-the-ground challenges. But we do work with partners to collect data on farm gate and FOB pricing, along with other data points related to labor conditions, environmental practices, et cetera. And then we work closely with auditors at the Fine Cacao and Chocolate Institute, or FCCI, to provide a third-party audit of that data before we go ahead and publish it. We publish that data because we really embrace transparency as an approach to enabling these global conversations on the importance of cacao pricing and producer profitability. And without the data, it's impossible to have this dialogue at all. So again, very exciting that this conversation is starting. In terms of the other recommendations of the paper beyond transparency on pricing across the value chain, we have also signed asymmetrical contracts. So we have for example, with producers in Belize on the ground, we sign contracts that commit us to purchasing 100% of their production, but allow the producers to sell wherever they'd like. So that is certainly a practice that we've adopted now for over a decade and find very useful. That's one of the, when we do feedback collection with producers, That is something we hear often, is that they really appreciate the stability that the market provides without tying them in. We also, I think, feel a very acute sense of responsibility. So we also not only track the farm gate price that's being paid, but we also report on average producer earnings or revenue across each geography where we source. This is data that's available to us. We do not yet have a living income reference price, so we don't have a LERP system within our value chain. I think for us, one of the challenges has been access to resources to do that work. But we have done work on analyzing and publishing cost of production data across multiple places where we source. So we have done deep dive workshops with producers. For example, in Guatemala, we've identified that the farm gate price that's being paid across multiple associations that we work with provides producers over 50% net income, net profit. But then when we combine that data on profit with the actual production and kilo sales of each individual producer in the association, we do see that the producers are not yet receiving what would be considered a living income. So it's clear that there is a lot of work to be done on this across both the bulk and the specialty sectors. I think often specialty is held up as sort of maybe we've figured this out. We certainly are not yet implementing all of the practices in this paper, but again, so exciting to see the roadmap. And I have many more thoughts, but I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. And I think that's always a comment of how does this scale in the commodity sector? Is this only possible in the specialty sector? I just want to follow up with a couple of the comments in the chat are around, the increasing requirements of EUDR. And that's going to be both, sort of an operational challenge as well as data, bringing complexity into the chain. The question was, considering that it's a legal requirement, who should pay for this? So who should pay for the costs? And then related to this, there's another question around whether you think there's an opportunity for farmers to make money from the collection and use of their data. Just thoughts for your business on those two.
Yeah, I mean, I think the onus really needs to be on traders, on intermediaries, to be managing this, the dynamics of the economics of this data collection with both producers and with brands and retailers. I think I am obviously, as someone working in the middle, I completely understand the traders' argument around companies not being willing to pay for the increased prices that some of the compliance or sustainability work is requiring. At the same time, I think sales is advocacy work, and there is a huge role, sustainability role, for traders to play in advocating through sales for these premiums and making sure that companies and retailers truly understand the problems that they're solving for their customers by paying these higher prices. What we're seeing right now in the market with prices at the highest levels we've seen in nearly 50 years is, in my perspective, a result of ignoring these externalities that we are now finally talking about incorporating into the business practices and pricing models. And I think all of us as an industry need to recognize that the work that we do, let's say over the next decade, to try to shift our model of doing business will contribute to better businesses, more sustainable supply chains from a pure, will this exist in 50 years perspective? And if we don't do that, I think we're at risk of seeing much higher prices in the future, much more dramatic issues. So yes, this is going to be a bullet for us all to bite, but we all need to be biting it as traders and ultimately as chocolate manufacturers, brands, consumers, and retailers. It is very clear that the farmers do not need any additional burden of cost put on them at this time. And this problem is not theirs to solve, it is ours to solve.
Great, thank you. There's a lot more we want to go into depth with you, but I want to pass over to our next panelist, Jordi van Hunk from IDH. So Jordi, IDH has been changing your strategy, doing quite a lot of work on living wage and now on living income. Can you talk a little bit about the new change in strategy, particularly around the focus on procurement and purchasing practices? When did you start sort of questioning the approach, and what are the major obstacles you think that we need to be tackling?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephanie, and also thank you, Anthony and Voice Network for the invitation to join in on this important discussion. Yeah, at IDH, we have had quite some discussions when designing our new program, which started in 2021 and runs until 2025, until the end of 2025. And it was really in those days, so I would say around 2020, and that we looked at all the impact data that we were able to collect of the investments that IDH and partners did, say, in the 2010-2020 period. And when we looked at that impact data, both on our investments when it came to living wage work, but I will limit myself to living income work for now, a lot of investments in smallholder agriculture sustainability programs, the net income effect that we could see from the data was either not there or was not we were not able to measure it actually properly, or at times it was even negative. And we were quite puzzled by that, and of course struck by that, and it led to an honest discussion in IDH on how to move forward and how to actually also make use of this new frame that living wage already brought before, and living income quickly became to give at the bandwagon of living wage initially. And I think that for us, it was a recognition that those concepts are very strong and needed to be embedded in our programs, and really needed to be defined as say the North Stars of impact in our work on what we call better income or better jobs. So when, for example, in cocoa, we defined our new strategy, we decided that every partnership that IDH would be involved in, whether it's at an ISCO level, or whether it would be at an individual company level, or whether it would be in partnership with the government, that we would actually put a living income front and center as the North Star for our engagement. And then secondly, we defined a roadmap, which not only bound to cocoa, but we actually want to work with the living income community to actually put a clear roadmap forward to say, well, let's start with measuring the gap in your supply chain, or as a sector, as an ISCO, to really make that living income calculation, the gap calculation, hopefully part of the one could say dashboards of procurement people. So that's really an important starting point for us, and I'm happy to report that by now we have quite a few partnerships with companies where we have started to do that. And that in itself offers a great conversation starter to then say, well, how do we then close the gap? Because many of us have signed commitments to get to that North Star of a living income. And it gets to a set of potential interventions. And we said quite soon after that also in this new phase of our work, we don't want to just, between brackets, support field level projects again and put the burden in a way on behavioral change of farmers, but actually also complement it with an approach to look at change in business practice and sector governance. So very much in line with what Anthony and the paper have set out. We fully agree to that we have to look as well to change in business practice, and acknowledging that, for example, the work on productivity is not a silver bullet to get to a living income. It's still very important. It has its place, and we need to look at change in business practice. So we put a lot of work now on procurement, and we actually deployed that in IDH by assigning a new role, a sustainable procurement director. My role was created to really continue to look at the impact we create. And if the impact is not sufficient, then we have to up our game. And the good news is that we are also working on a procurement framework, in this case together with Mars and a lot of other companies. And I would love to continue to discuss also with Voice on how to move this debate further, also based on your paper, and hopefully other papers, other initiatives that will come up on this very important topic of sustainable procurement.
Great, thanks, Jordi. And I'm just curious, with the companies that are engaged with you on the living income roadmap, can you mention a couple of what you see as the major obstacles? As you said, you're working particularly with Mars on a procurement framework, so there is some interest and will from the companies engage you. What are the obstacles that you see? And maybe particularly reflecting on the 3 areas that the voice paper pulls out: price, sharing risk, and being accountable.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a lot of recognition that you need to increase reward for farmers. I think when we start to discuss price, it gets difficult. It's not that people don't want to discuss it anymore. So I see a big shift, and also within IDH, that we need to discuss the issue of fair price. And then it gets difficult to, for example, get through a conversation on how living income reference price could be implemented at scale with all partners involved. But I would say it has changed quite a lot over the past years, because it's not only the recognition of ourselves or voice or others that we have had lack of impact. We see a similar kind of conclusion being drawn in many companies that are also frustrated by the lack of progress. So I think that's an opening we have. And as described in the paper, we see some good initiatives to do direct payments to farmers through cash transfer schemes. The PES was mentioned. You now have also companies that are willing to pay for data provided to the supply chain. So I think those are very positive developments. But the issue of a reference price at scale is, I think, very much still a sensitive topic, and we need to further discuss that in the sector for the years to come. When it comes to risk sharing, long-term contracts, there's a lot of openness to explore. Sometimes also even a shock that some long-term contracts that brands have with traders are not copied into long-term contracts between traders and cooperatives. So those sort of eye-openers also for some brands are, I think, very important. And there is a lot of openness and willingness to look into it, especially if we as a community are able to work with those companies and give some practical guidance on this. And I would say a big blocker that we see now in the conversation is really around the increased need and cost for compliance of a lot of companies. And now we talk to procurement teams and we start to understand a bit better their world. There is so much pressure now on reporting that sometimes we are concerned that it gets a pressure on really making impact in a wrong way. So is the compliance leading to impact, or actually can it go against it? We don't know yet. We do hear a lot of feedback on that. And I think then transparently reporting, I think there are some hurdles with antitrust regulation. But again, something I think we should be able to get through. As companies have sustainability programs, I think it's only fair to also ask then, well, how does this rhyme with your behavior in the market? We would find that a good way forward to discuss that and integrate that in reporting.
Great, thanks, Jordi. There's a lot there. I want to come back first to Anthony, to you. There's a number of questions that I think you've been trying to answer virtually. And then I want to turn to the audience, some of the unanswered questions. Ferdy van Heerden, I'm going to come to you next. But Anthony, before I go to Ferdy, do you want to respond to anything that the panel has said quickly?
Yeah, and it'd be great if when we start answering these questions that the other panelists also turn their camera on so that we can maybe have a bit of a conversation about this as well and try to figure out, also respond to each other. You say this, I've got some follow-up questions around this. Because, for example, like Jordi, you're saying, look, actually making the calculation on what you should pay separate from all these additional interventions like PES, like cash transfers, like payments for data. The main question that I have is can you actually have a valid sustainability strategy? Can you talk about sustainable cocoa if you haven't calculated whether the price you're paying is enough for an average farmer to get out of poverty? Because isn't that the core question that should be at the design of everything? And so when you say it's really sensitive, it might be sensitive, but isn't it part of our job to at some point start talking about the questions that we might not want to answer, but that we do have to answer. I'm interested to see kind of how those conversations within IDH are going.
Yeah, so I was in this case not reflecting on within IDH as much as that what I see in our conversations with partners. I thought that was the question of Stephanie, but answering yours, how is it going in IDH? In IDH, we have one important metric, and that is the living income gap closing. So we try to measure that, and that then also includes other forms of income. It includes the cash transfers, etc. So I think you give an opening in the paper, right? That can be part of the gap closing calculation. I think it's an interesting thing that you've put forward in your paper that if you have done that and there is still a gap, that you need to top it up somehow with a price intervention. We need to discuss that also internally. It's a new type of thinking, and I find that an interesting thought, and we need to further discuss that. I think it would help a lot if we can, as a follow-up, think through together with the community. What will it take to do that, to even go beyond that, and particularly in a market that is where it is now, how do we get some buy-in for that? It should be possible with this market that we have now, right?
The prices don't even have to go up very much based on today. Now, obviously, the Ivorian and Ghanaian farmers are not getting the current world market prices, but that is actually a different conversation than the one today. Stephanie, sorry, I don't want to moderate it. I really want you to be able to take over here. So don't want.
No worries. No worries. It is a conversation. I do want to flag this question or comment with Ferde van Heerden about why aren't we talking also about redesigning the value chain? Desiree, you talked about co-ops essentially in a position of just collecting and aggregating and not really with any other sort of negotiating or value addition role. Ferde, do you want to unmute yourself if you can and ask your question? Pose it to the panel.
Sure. Great. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, excellent. And hi, Desiree. I look forward to seeing the Copasa team next week when we kick off our living income project with Pro Planteurs there. This builds on a conversation we had with Anthony about 2 weeks ago, where the way the system works is actually fundamentally broken, and just throwing money at it won't necessarily solve the issue. One example, for instance, is a factor that we never, ever see in the analysis of living income is the cost of lending for smallholders. So in a lot of instances, because they have to pay their school fees in August and the crop comes in October, November, they have to go into short-term debt where they're paying 30 to 100% on short-term loans. So that gets priced into their farm activities. And if you have licensed buying agents going into the field, they are writing off enormous amounts of bad debts because they are pre-financing their purchases. These are topics that are just simply never addressed, and they are structural inefficiencies that come from the fact that farmers are forced to sell their dry cacao as a kind of finished product, and there's no real reinnovation or reintegration of the value chain to de-risk the farming position, but to also improve the steps afterwards. So a lot to unpack there, but I think it's important that we don't just look at this with a kind of hammer and nail approach, that thinking, just money is going to solve the issue. We actually do have to redesign the way the value chain works.
Thank you, Ferde. Desiree, I don't know if you would like to respond, any ideas that you might have from the Copasa perspective on that?
Oui, merci Stéphanie. Les problèmes des producteurs, nous sommes en train d'en parler, nous le disons, c'est pas maintenant que ça sera résolu. Les approches telles que je l'ai dit tantôt ne nous prennent pas en compte. Ça, c'est sûr, ça ne nous prend pas en compte. Donc, du coup, notre souhait, c'est de voir des programmes qui pourront nous permettre d'amortir un peu nos charges. Parce que nous sommes conscients que nous voulons être des entrepreneurs agricoles. Nous voulons être maîtres, n'est-ce pas, de nos plantations. Essayer de travailler pour avoir de très bons rendements, vendre nos produits à des prix intéressants et dégager une marge bénéficiaire. Mais ça, aujourd'hui, malgré les programmes d'éducation financière qu'on nous donne, on dit il y a tellement de... Mais on ne peut pas dégager de marge financière. Donc, les approches, tout à l'heure, celle qui a parlé a fait cas, par exemple, des logements. Ces choses ne sont pas prises en compte. La famille, la nourriture, les travaux au champ, dans la plantation, toutes les actions que nous menons depuis la cueillette jusqu'à la vente du produit, rien n'est pris en compte. Le seul critère que les gens prennent, c'est certainement dans les bourses, lorsque les prix s'édulent, c'est ce qu'eux, ils gagnent. C'est là-bas, c'est là, c'est à partir de leur gain qu'ils fixent le prix. Mais nous, les producteurs, toute la charge que nous avons, personne ne vient et ne nous dit, voilà, comme vous dépensez tant, tel montant, voilà, on va prendre en compte personne. Donc, l'approche, nous cherchons la meilleure et espérons que nous allons la trouver très bientôt. Merci Stéphanie.
Thank you, Desiree. Just before I go back to the audience, Emily, Jordi, Anthony, do you have any responses or thoughts on the point that Ferdi raises around redesign of the chain?
I think we definitely need to look at redesigning the chain on a lot of different levels. I mean, the cost of credit is ridiculous, right? I think that there's an even more fundamental question that I think Desiree brought up here. He says, look, pricing has nothing to do with what we need as farmers. And I think that that's where the core of the question lies. And maybe also the core question that we're trying to ask in this paper is, do we think that just the market, which is like an kind of an unknown variable, so to speak, determines what the value of this product should be? Or do we think there are other variables that need to come in play? And let me bring in a parallel to this. Every global north country has got a minimum wage because we know that supply and demand, if you just let supply and demand determine how much workers get paid in factories, they would get screwed over by power, because power does that. Power always tries to increase their power. Then why, if even the United States has a minimum wage, and you can have a conversation about whether that minimum wage is fine, but even a country that is as fundamentally free market as the US has realized that you cannot let supply and demand just dictate everything, especially not if it comes to paying workers. So why do we accept that idea as a God-given law that is universal in nature for commodities? And I think that that's where part of the question is do we allow this system of abuse of power to determine everything about how much a farmer is paid? Or do we say, no, we actually bring in place the needs of people in this as well, which is exactly the point that Desiree was bringing in here. So I think that's the core question that we need to ask. And that might be more philosophical than practical, but I do think that that's the driving factor behind why we're writing this paper as well, is to figure out, is the world the way it is, the way we want it to be in the future? And if not, how do we redesign it so that it does reflect what we think should happen? Because if it's good enough for our workers in Europe and the United States, it should be good enough for the workers in West Africa and in Latin America as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Emily or Jordi, any additional thoughts?
Sure, yeah, I completely agree. And I would just add that I think one element that we really miss when we treat cocoa as one fungible commodity is the contextualization and the really unique costs and realities for producers in very different environments with different costs of capital, different farm size realities. And so there in the comments, there are questions, for example, around the rainforests model of premiums. I think anytime we try to find a one-size-fits-all solution, we are going to fail. And so part of this rethinking of the industry and of the way the business of cocoa buying works is that we have to become much more grounded in the reality of where we're sourcing, who are the humans we're sourcing with, who are our partners, and really building from that onwards rather than backwards from what the market says.
Thank you. Jordi, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just I really like that comment, Emily. Thank you. And just to add to that, that we have tried through our engagement with our FarmFit fund to actually de-risk some of the local lenders, for example, in the Côte d'Ivoire market, to service the cocoa farmers with much better products. So I think that's still something that we're really keen to work on. So I would agree with that comment of Ferdi. I think another one would be to look at the future of processing in countries, right, of origin. There are some good examples for that as well. And another one would be to try to use much more of the side products of cocoa, and there have been some small scale initiatives around that, but maybe there is potential there too. And the last one would be that we see some companies that are willing to source multiple crops from the same farms, right? So that we actually are able to support the entire income of those farms. But that can only happen in a slightly larger farms, probably, that do more than cocoa alone. Although we realize that a lot of farmers are already diversified, so there is some potential there too. Thanks.
Great, all important ideas as well. I just want to turn now to the audience, get a little bit more of the voices from all of you. I'm going to go to Yoka of Tony's Chocolonely. Obviously, Tony's has been working on this topic for some time. You use the living income reference price. I'm curious what your responses are to the recommendations in the Voice paper and some of the thoughts that have been raised by the panel.
Yeah, hi, everybody. This has been an interesting discussion so far. We got a little preview of some of the recommendations in the paper a few weeks ago when Andrew came to come speak to us, because we're always looking for really feedback on input on how to improve the system on what we're doing. I think a lot of the practices we implement already. Emily, asymmetrical contracts have been a part of what we do for a long time. We commit to buying, but we don't force people to sell to us. We don't force the cooperatives to sell to us. So those types of dynamics have been there for a long term. Very core to what we do is indeed long-term contracts, and also very, very directly, we know exactly which cooperatives that we're working with. So there's a lot of the procurement, and then of course paying the living income reference price. There's a lot of procurement practices that we do address. I think one thing I'm really proud of at Tony's Open Chain is that we try to address the scale issue. So Tony Chocolonely as a brand is trying to grow as fast as possible so we can buy more cocoa, but we also proactively invite other companies to join us in our way of working. Are we doing that at scale in the level of 15% of cocoa coming out of Côte d'Ivoire? No, not yet. But at least I think we're trying to be a voice out there that says there are more companies willing to pay this price. There are more companies willing to make a long-term direct commitment to the cocoa farmers that they're buying from. So I also really resonated with the comment around knowing uniquely who you're working with. While I think that there are that public procurement practices, good agricultural practices, governance practices are applicable to cocoa farmers worldwide, we specifically look at Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. And we have sort of annual plans with each of the cooperatives that we're working with. So, and then things that we're challenged on, I'm very interested in the ideas of maybe making some volume commitments in like some guaranteed volume takeoffs is something that we're willing to explore internally. We're certainly triggered to look at the standardized contracts. If there's anything that we can improve there, I'll be looking at the paper to see if there's things that we can implement more clearly. Then I have a question for the panel, or I would put it in for discussion. The idea around the future of processing in country, in origin, we hear that over and over again. You also, you hear it in feedback also from the governments of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. But I think that we need to then as a community look whether the increased income there is going to farmers or going towards the cocoa community. So let's not substitute one thing and say that it's an answer to something that it might not be an answer to. Something we wonder also at Tony's Open Chain with income diversification, we do it from our position in the market is that we're buying cocoa to make chocolate. With income diversification projects is then again, is the income going to farmers to fill the gap towards a living income, or is it filling some other need within the community? That's information that I'd be curious to hear what this group thinks about that, or if those are the right answers. I think we should always be very, very sharp on what interventions that we're doing are benefiting the cocoa community, which is valid, and which ones are benefiting farmers individually.
Great questions. Desiree, you want to take a first crack? I think particularly for the community of Copasa, how might you see in-country processing benefiting your members or not? As well as I would imagine Copasa has income diversification efforts. What value do you see there, either to your individual members or the communities they live in? I'm assuming Desiree is waiting for the translation.
Oui, je souhaiterais réagir par rapport à ce qu'a dit Jock, notamment au sujet de la consommation locale. Est-ce que cela pourrait aussi contribuer à augmenter le revenu? Je pense que il va falloir effectivement revoir aussi, quand on parle des pratiques d'achat, il va falloir revoir aussi peut-être le mode de consommation aussi du cacao à un moment donné. Voilà. Parce que cette culture, cette plante a été, a été cultivée dans nos pays depuis des années. Mais malheureusement, nous n'avons jamais su aussi, c'est une faiblesse dans le dispositif, nous pensons, parce que aujourd'hui, est-ce que si nous consommons, si nous allons à la consommation, pas forcément du chocolat, mais il y a d'autres produits. Si nous arrivons, nous parvenons à la consommation, est-ce que cela ne peut pas avoir un impact? Pour l'instant, nous sommes en train de mener des expériences pilotes, même au sein de ma coopérative, pour voir un peu ce qu'on peut faire. Mais là aussi, il va falloir voir des acteurs assez du bien-être producteurs. Si c'est fait, je pense que ça peut aller parce que je peux partager avec vous l'expérience pilote que ma coopérative est en train de mener au sujet de la consommation locale d'un certain nombre de produits à base de cacao et l'impact que cette consommation est en train d'avoir sur déjà le revenu des producteurs. Ça aussi, c'est une piste que nous sommes en train d'explorer. On n'a pas attendu que des gens viennent nous le dire. Nous avons commencé à explorer, notamment dans la transformation des cabosses jetés, des cabosses utilisés, notamment la fabrication des sous-produits, et puis essayer aussi, n'est-ce pas, puisque on le dit, faut, tout le monde, quand on parle du prix, tout le monde n'est pas, les gens ne sont pas d'accord. Une fois que tu parles du prix, voilà. Je me rappelle encore, l'année dernière, j'étais à Bruxelles, où nous avons, j'étais avec Anthony au Fonds mondial, au congrès du Fonds mondial. Dès qu'on a parlé du prix, tout le monde n'est pas d'accord. Là, on n'est jamais d'accord sur les prix. Alors, et qu'est-ce que les gens nous disent? C'est l'offre et la demande. OK, mais est-ce qu'on ne peut pas inverser le système? C'est parce qu'il y en a beaucoup sur le marché qu'on nous dit qu'on ne peut pas payer cher. Mais on peut travailler à réduire l'offre sur le marché à travers la consommation locale. Si la consommation locale est élevée, l'offre sur le marché mondial va diminuer. Mais là, on verra. Donc, je pense que c'est aussi une piste. Mais nous, la COPASA est en train d'expérimenter cela. Et je vous dis, l'année dernière, par exemple, nous avons payé les assurances de nos membres. On a payé. Parce qu'on a commencé déjà à transformer, on a payé. Cette année, là où le prix est à 1000 francs, nous, on donne plus que ça. Donc, ce sont des choses sur lesquelles nous pouvons aussi travailler avec un certain nombre d'acteurs. Ce n'est pas encore bien, ça ne fonctionne pas très, très bien encore, mais nous avons une expérience pilote, une expérience qui est formidable, qui est soutenue par quelques partenaires. Voilà ce que je voulais dire.
Thank you, Desiree. Sorry, there's a lot there that we can go into. I think particularly your point around developing new markets, developing interregional and domestic markets is quite interesting. Certainly also being talked about by producers of other crops like coffee. So really helpful. Anthony, I want to turn to you. How do you look at the questions that Yuka is bringing up around income diversification?
So I like to use this analogy often when we start talking about paying a fair price to farmers, where there's two people standing next to a box, and one of the people tells to the other that we need to think of outside of the box solutions, and then the other person asks, but what's inside the box? And then the first person says, we don't talk about that. And that's often what, when we bring up price, is the conversation goes to. Is like, let's talk about purchasing practice. Let's talk about how farmers can be paid more for the cocoa they sell. And it's like, we want to talk about everything. It's like, I'm an outdoors kind of a person, and some of my outdoors clothes is being treated with this water repellent coating, right? And you put water on it and it automatically kind of goes off. And it feels like the whole cocoa sustainability conversation is treated in a price repellent coating. The minute we talk about price, we want to talk about everything except for how much we're paying the farmer. And I think that it's important to talk about diversification. I think it's important to talk about processing in country, although I'd like to point out the fact that a lot of cocoa gets processed in West Africa, right? Like every year, the Netherlands and Cote d'Ivoire are head to head as to which of the two processes more cocoa, right? So I'm not quite sure that processing itself is as key to a change structure. I actually think that there is a really important conversation around rural development strategies that look at how do you get West Africa to not be a food importing region in the world. Like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana both import food, which is bizarre considering they're massive agricultural countries. So, and that would actually add a lot of market, right? But that's, once again, we dive into the price repellent coating of the conversation. And I think that it's our instinct to talk about everything except for this core question that we're trying to bring to the table. Yes, it's important to look at diversification. Yes, it's important to look at processing. Yes, it's important to look at rest products. Yes, it's all these things are important, but also we need to talk about pricing. And it kind of reminds me a little bit about 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the conversation started to become stronger and stronger around regulation. And a lot of the private sector were saying, yes, we believe in regulation, but it needs to be part of a smart mix. And with the word smart mix, it's usually them everything except for the mandatory part, right? And it feels a little bit like we're diving into that point around pricing, that we're still trying to look at a mix of everything except for the pricing thing. But that is, it's like the core of the atom, right? All the other electrons are around in a purchasing practices structure around how much are you actually going to pay the farmer? And if you don't answer that question, then the atom actually is hollow on the inside. I'm not sure that that's the way we want to go. So I'd like to challenge us all to sometimes step back from that reflex of looking at everything else and to spend some time at this uncomfortable place of saying, so how do we tackle this issue? Not because it's the only issue, far from it, but it is one of those issues that we somehow can't get our grasp on. So that would be my response to the conversation so far. There's a lot of questions I'd love to answer as well, but I think I'll just leave it here and see, Jordi, Emily, you guys have been a bit quiet and looking at me on this, so I'd be very interested in your takes on this as well.
And before you come in, I also just want to pose this, Jordi and Emily, to both of you, that we know it isn't that if we're talking about large commodity buyers can't pay more. Of course, as price go up and everybody pays those prices, price go down, then it is that they can't pay more than their competitors. And this is particularly for publicly owned companies. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around that, as how do you get at the levers, whether it be shareholders or C-suite incentives that allow for that reality to be acknowledged and changed. Either one of you come in. Go ahead, Jordi.
Thank you. Well, I can start, and then Emily, please come in. So you're right, Anthony. I think I like the analogy with the water repellent stuff on the coating. It is a difficult conversation, and indeed, Stephanie, it has to do with if you talk about the big market, it's indeed about those ownership models and incentives. I think we at IDH, we do liaise quite a bit with investors, and for example, quite a lot of investors have endorsed our living wage or living income roadmaps. So really challenging companies in their investors' conversations on whether they are actually measuring the gaps, whether they have a living income strategy in place, and hopefully then the next step will be to see impact, and maybe as part of that, we should also say that price needs to be a mandatory element of a living income strategy. We do recommend that it is taken into every living income strategy. So yeah, investors are there. CEOs, I don't think we have yet done enough to reach that level. We know that science-based targets for climate are definitely chefsache in boardrooms. ESG risks are now living wage, living income, not yet, hopefully getting there more and more, and maybe there the regulation will help that it actually gets much more into boardrooms, because in the end the procurement teams need to be incentivized by boardrooms to act on what we are saying here, right? So that indeed is a challenge. We do, as IES now, have a few partnerships where we bring together procurement and sustainability teams and actually go with them through the data we encounter together on living income, and then discuss that the business case is often extremely weak for farmers to make the transition, and that you have to look at price and other things. So these are encouraging steps, but we're not there yet. I agree with you, absolutely. Over to you, Emily.
That's very interesting, Jordi. And yeah, great to hear that you're doing that work between both procurement and sustainability. I think it's clear that there is a fiduciary duty for companies to manage the significant risks in their supply chains that come from ignoring the externalities. And as Jordi mentions, we've seen that dialogue progress much more quickly on environmental issues, whether it's climate or now deforestation with the regulations. I think, Anthony, your point earlier around the minimum wage in the global north, and how each company is obviously required to be following those rules and compliant with those rules. Compliance with responsibility in our supply chains is also soon going to be required by regulation. So I think the more that companies can get ahead of the regulations, if there's living income requirements that will be coming down the pipe in 5 years or maybe a little bit more or less, then it's really I imagine shareholders and boards would be convincible as to why this makes sense to start really understanding and working on now.
And I think that's also what we were saying at the beginning when we're talking. It's going to move from a moral or a business imperative to a legal imperative. And, paying a fair price, when you as a sustainability manager go to the C-suite level and say, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, you're going to get a very different answer than when you go to the C-suite level and say, we got to do this or otherwise you're going to jail. And that is over time the place we're going to get to, because if a company chooses to undercut the minimum wage, the people that choose that go to jail at some point, right? And I think that that's where it will go over the long term. We're not there yet, but I think changing the system is a long-term patience game anyway.
Okay, so I want to just respect the questions from the audience here. And Anthony, there's one that is very critical from anonymous attendee. You know, I'd like to see cocoa farmers earning a living income. Are you of the opinion that every single farmer should earn a living income, or should there be metrics and assumptions for sort of viable minimum farm size, for example? And I think this also speaks to what are the farmer's responsibility? You know, it can any farmer that just has a few trees, should they be paid a price that they can earn a living income? Your thoughts on that?
It's a really important question. And I think that when we say that you need realistic variables in your living income reference calculation, then viable farm size, et cetera, becomes a part of those realistic variables. However, I actually think that in cocoa, often the realism goes the other way. And that's where a lot of the calculations forget to value labor properly. And so where often we speak about minimum viable farm size, actually, I think there's a maximum viable farm size per household of somewhere between 4 and 6 hectares. If you get above that, you're going to have to hire labor to do the work for you on your farm. And one of the other questions there is like, what do we know about hired labor? We really don't know enough about the cost of hired labor. There's a big gap in data. Also, the data that companies have internally around how sharecroppers and tenants also fall into this conversation. So I actually think that very often our calculations on whether or not we're solving the poverty tend to underestimate how much hired labor is actually used to do this. And if the hired labor does not get calculated at a living wage, then your living income calculation is based on exploitative wage labor, which also can't be part of what we're trying to achieve either. And so I think that bringing in these variables, we probably tend to err on the side of optimism as to how much work diversification costs, how much work productivity increase costs, how much work is actually involved in all of these things. Now, having said that, yes, there are farms that are very small. The good thing about a very small farm is, and that's where things can become quite technical, so I'll try to not get too calculated here. But all the data shows that the smaller a farm, the more time the household has per hectare. And so actually the higher productivity and the better the quality they can get on the farm. So sometimes on smaller farms, there actually is a business case because you can increase quality or yield. But you will get to a threshold under which it's not viable to run that farm. What that threshold is a lot harder to tell particularly, but I think that you do need to start putting that into your calculations. And there can be different ways to approach that over time. But last year, Friedel Hoots-Adams from the Sudwind Institute, my co-researcher for the Cocoa Barometer, wrote a really interesting article, a research called The Poverty Trap, which is really looking at this problem around labor and how much does labor actually factor into the calculations of net income increases for farmers. And so anybody looking at those details, I'd strongly urge to go to that document, which I'm sure we're going to find and put in the chat before this call is ended. So.
Thanks, Anthony. And I don't know if any panelists have any other comments before I go to other questions. Okay, so there's a couple questions here. Also, there were about the role of governments, and I know that's not the focus of this today, but the specific one around what obstacles to asymmetric contracts and maybe living income reference pricing would we expect from the regulators, CCC or COCOBOD. Does anyone have a comment on that? I know none of you are from the public sector, so fine if passed, but I just want to pose that to the panel.
just to answer that, Stephanie, our question, but we got a lot of questions when we were drafting this paper around, so, but what about the role of the government, right? And I think that those are valid questions. Once again, though, this is part of the price repellent coding of the sector. It's not an unfair question. And so what we are hoping to do sometime next year is to come out with kind of a sister paper to this paper on purchasing practices, what role the governments have to play in this. And I think that you need to differentiate between the role in consuming countries and the roles in producer countries. And I think that in consuming countries, we just really need to see purchasing practices and living income become touchstones of regulation. It also answers to some of the questions in the Q&A. This cannot just be voluntary. And it also ties into what Emily was saying. It needs to become mandatory. So it's actually really quite simple for the producer, for the consumer governments, is this needs to become part of a mandatory regulatory playing field. In producer countries, things are more complex because it deals with the transparency and accountability of income and how that's reinvested in rural infrastructure. It's got to do with rural development strategies and policies. It's got to do with supply management, et cetera, et cetera. So things become very complex there. And I think that every answer we're going to give now will not do that complexity justice. And so that's why we are hoping sometime next year to write a sister paper to this one around that. And if we don't get a separate paper, then at the very least, we'll have a full chapter on this in next year's Cocoa Barometer.
Okay, great. So Desiree, I want to come to you because there's two questions I think be interesting to hear your opinion on. So there was a question from Judy, specifically around maybe in COPASA, when do cocoa farmers receive payment? In the past, we've heard about delays and payment coming up to a month after they deliver their cocoa. So that might be, excuse me, speaking to the working capital capacity of co-ops to pay. And then the other one, Jen Beer from Rainforest Alliance, she talked about the proposed changes to the Rainforest Alliance premium. I don't know if COPASA works with Rainforest Alliance, but I would imagine so. And just curious if you've worked with that at all and are familiar with the proposal to have a minimum cash payment to farmers from the Rainforest Alliance premium. So those two questions around timing of payments to your member farmers and the Rainforest Alliance premium proposal. Desiree, you are still muted. Can't hear you.
Ah, désolé, ça ouvert maintenant. Oui, les délais de paiement varient. Nos agriculteurs, dans le fonctionnement, nous les coopératives, en fait, ce sont des coopératives, nous les responsables de la coopérative, quand nous devons collecter le cacao, généralement, nous bénéficions d'un appui financier, ce qui nous permet donc de payer les producteurs dans un délai assez raisonnable. Mais quand on n'a pas les moyens, ça devient un peu difficile. Ça devient un peu difficile que les producteurs viennent avec leurs produits. C'est bon? Que les producteurs viennent avec leurs produits et que par la suite, nous puissions aller vendre et puis venir leur donner l'argent. Maintenant, spécifiquement aux producteurs de la COPASA, actuellement, on n'a pas trop de problèmes en ce qui concerne les délais de paiement. Je vous ai dit que nous sommes en train d'expérimenter, nous sommes dans une phase expérimentale de transformation et de consommation locale de nos produits à base de cacao, ce qui nous permet de capter de l'argent sur le marché local et de gérer, enfin, je vais dire, de payer rapidement nos producteurs. Ce n'est pas encore très grand, mais après, nous sommes à la deuxième année et ça semble marcher bien. Deuxième, vous avez parlé de, je sais pas, du paiement de quoi? Rainforest Alliance, c'est ça? Stéphanie?
Oui, la question est que comment ça marche avec la prime de Rainforest et la spécification de la prime pour le producteur, la prime pour le coopératif.
Bon, ces primes-là, généralement, c'est Rainforest Alliance qui définit déjà le mode de partage. Donc, ce qui est décidé jusqu'à présent, c'est de payer les producteurs par mobile money. C'est ce qui est décidé. Maintenant, les producteurs, il y a beaucoup de difficultés aussi là-bas. Tous les producteurs n'ont pas accès au réseau mobile money. Tous les producteurs ne sont pas dans des zones où il y a des points, des points pour retirer, hein, des guichets, hein, n'est-ce pas, pour retirer l'argent. Donc, ces primes viennent généralement à la fin de la campagne. À la fin de la campagne, donc, aider le producteur, c'est ce qu'on nous dit. Mais en arrière, le travail qu'on nous demande, nous les producteurs, on nous demande du travail pour obtenir cette prime-là. On nous demande un gros travail. Parce que donc, ça vient, ça, si ça peut aider les producteurs, mais ce n'est pas suffisant. Donc, parlons du fait que tout ce qu'on nous donne n'est pas suffisant. Donc, une prime de 25 francs CFA pour quelqu'un qui fait 1 tonne de cacao, ça fait 25 000 francs. À peine peut-être 40 euros. Bon, 40 euros comme prime annuelle, qu'est-ce que ça peut faire? Qu'est-ce que ça peut faire? Aujourd'hui, en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a le salaire moyen, il y a le salaire minimum que l'État a fixé. C'est 75 000 francs CFA. Je crois que ça doit faire autour de 100, 100, 120, peut-être 120, 125 euros. Ça, c'est le salaire moyen pour tous les fonctionnaires, pour tous les travailleurs. Mais nous, les producteurs, et puis ça, c'est mensuel. Alors, si on prend le salaire mensuel de 75 000 francs CFA et qu'on multiplie par 12 mois, ça veut dire que le plus petit travailleur en Côte d'Ivoire doit avoir autour de 750 plus 100, ça fait autour de 900 000 francs CFA, soit environ 1500 euros par an. Ça, c'est le plus petit producteur, environ 900 000. Mais ça c'est les petits travailleurs. Ça, c'est les petits travailleurs. Mais nous, les producteurs, on n'a pas un minimum. On n'a pas de minimum. Donc, nous, les primes qu'on reçoit, c'est en fonction de nos rendements. Et quand ça ne marche, souvent, on nous dit qu'il y a surproduction. Quand on ne veut pas acheter, on dit qu'il y a surproduction. Après, on nous dit non, il n'y en a pas. Donc, on jongle. Et quand on nous donne une prime de 40 euros pour une année, bon, ça ne représente rien. Donc, je ne parle même pas des délais. Ce n'est pas suffisant. Et ce n'est pas du tout suffisant pour nous. Voilà ce que je voulais dire.
Thank you, Desiree. Very important. So I believe Virginie Mfegwe from Rainforest Alliance, you raised your hand. If so, please feel free to unmute and make your comment.
Okay, so I don't know why I don't have the video option, so apologize. I will just I will just try to add some clarification.
We just lost you, Virginie. Are you still there?
I'm not hearing anything either, Stephanie.
Qu'il faudrait peut-être. I hope the network is fine. So, okay, let me go in English and then I hope Adu has a translation. Or let me go in French so that he will have it directly. Donc, Désiré, ce que je disais, c'est que c'est pas Rainforest qui fait la distribution, qui établit la clé de distribution de la prime ERA. Cette distribution, la clé de distribution est faite par le gouvernement et son représentant, le Conseil du café cacao. Donc, vous avez peut-être vu l'année dernière des lettres qui sont sorties à cet effet qui demandaient comment distribuer. Alors, ce n'est pas non plus Rainforest Alliance qui détermine le niveau de la prime. La prime n'est pas payée par Rainforest Alliance. La prime, elle est payée par les chocolatiers. Et elle est distribuée à travers la chaîne à partir du chocolatier, chez l'exportateur, chez la coopérative et chez le producteur. Donc, je sais qu'il y a souvent cette confusion. Rainforest ne fixe pas la prime, ni la clé de distribution, elle est fixée par le gouvernement. Le niveau de la prime se négocie entre l'exportateur, le chocolatier. Et tout à l'heure, je n'ai pas suivi toute la conférence, mais il y a eu quelque chose sur la question des contrats. Nous sommes tous d'accord que tant que la coopérative n'a pas un contrat fiable et un contrat avec l'exportateur pour dire, tu m'as demandé 1000 tonnes de cacao certifié, tu vas payer les 1000 tonnes, ça pose un problème. Et nous sommes tous conscients de ça. Mais un seul organisme ne peut pas porter tous les problèmes. C'est vraiment quelque chose qui se décide avec plusieurs acteurs. Et quand bien même nous sommes conscients que c'est petit, nous ne sommes pas en mesure de pouvoir augmenter la prime tout seul. Ce qu'on a essayé de faire par le passé, et ça n'a pas marché, c'était de demander que le producteur ait un minimum dans cette prime qui est payée par le chocolatier. Et ce minimum, c'était 70 francs par kilo. Non, 70 $. Donc, ça faisait à peu près 40-45 francs par kilo. Et c'était vraiment dans la norme pour sécuriser la prime pour le producteur. Mais l'année dernière, vous avez vu ce qui s'est passé. Ça n'a pas été accepté parce que quand on donnait 45 francs au producteur, la coopérative se retrouvait avec 15 ou 20 francs parce que les contrats sont négociés entre l'exportateur et le chocolatier sur 3 ans. Donc, la prime ne peut pas bouger en 1 an. Donc, il fallait des négociations entre exportateurs et chocolatiers pour augmenter la prime, pour aller augmenter ce qu'on allait reverser à la coopérative. Et ça a posé un problème et le gouvernement a tranché et il a dit on suspend cette prime minimum du producteur et on va garder la même clé de distribution qui est justement 30 francs à la coopérative, 30 francs au producteur. Donc voilà, c'était juste pour clarifier ça, Monsieur Adou, quand bien même je suis d'accord que cette prime ne peut pas vraiment combler le gap de revenu vital. Merci. Thank you, Stephanie. I just wanted to make this clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, Virginie. So we're coming to the end of our session here. There's a lot more to talk about. I imagine there's still many questions, many comments. I just want to, Jordi and Emily, you haven't spoken in a bit, just give a final word to you both, and then Anthony, I'm going to hand it over to you for the final words. Jordi?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here, and also for making us uncomfortable, Anthony and friends. And we're willing to go more into that uncomfortability, particularly around price. At the same time, we want to continue to see progress and have companies with us, not against us. So that is the big challenge, and I really like the way you've laid the issues out in the paper, and we're willing to further engage with you and stakeholders on this important topic. Thank you.
Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, thank you to Anthony and the Voice Network, and also to Jordi and Desiree as well. I think from my perspective as a smaller trader in this market, where the expectations I think will continue to increase around transparency, traceability, and compliance with pending regulations. The dream is definitely to have an accurate and agreed upon living income reference price calculation for each specific context of production of cocoa. And as one of the questions pointed out, to be able to manage that calculation in an agile way so that it can be effectively tweaked as macroeconomic and other factors shift within that context. As an SME, we have not been able to invest in a full LARP analysis in the geographies where we source. And so I think to any philanthropists or foundations who are on this webinar or following this discussion, establishing a really broad-reaching campaign to get these calculations in place across all of the geographies where significant cocoa is being produced, and also investing in the technology to make this a pretty scalable process across even not large geographies where cocoa is being sourced, so that this really can become a reality for cocoa producers and the conversation can really begin. I think until we have those calculations in place and a clear sort of set of resources available to companies to do this initial work, to even identify what the prices are that need to be paid, that is what, in my perspective, is need to turn this from a conversation into a reality. And I'm looking forward to supporting this work however I can.
Clear call out. Thank you, Emily. And Anthony, over to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. I want to thank Desiree for being here and to dialing in from the realities really on the field. I want to thank Emily for her time, and I've been following the work at Uncommon Cacao for many years now. And when we were about to launch this webinar, which we came up with the idea, you know, we're releasing this, we could do a webinar like somewhere last week. So we're also very happy for everyone's flexibility. But the minute I knew that we were doing this, I wanted Emily in this call because Uncommon is doing such an amazing job at their transparency. And I think that, you know, we're known as an organization that is critical about the things that are happening in the cocoa sector, but also we like to give credit where credit is due. And I think the transparency that Uncommon Cacao has been putting forward for a very long time is something that deserves applause and credit. So thank you very much for sharing that experience today, Emily. And also I want to thank Jordi, and the reason for that is, Jordi, we've been interacting with IDH since IDH started. I think we're kind of almost about as old as each other, IDH and the Voice Network. And I think that for a very long time, we were often sitting at opposite sides of a conversation. And I would like to acknowledge that the last 2 years, particularly, we're seeing IDH come from strengthening the idea that farmers need to go their own way out of poverty to realizing that there actually are some more systemic changes that need to happen. And I think this idea for market transformation is coming clearer and clearer out of IDH, and Jordi, you and your team are doing a really important job at bringing that forward. And so I'd like to see this still as some of the first steps. And like in 10 years time, we'll look back at this and saying, oh, can you remember when we said pricing was uncomfortable? And, you know, I'd love that vision to be where we are. There are so many important questions that we could not answer here today. There's still a few out there. And I've thanked Emily, I've thanked Desiree, I've thanked Jordi. I have not yet thanked Stephanie, who, like the rest of the team, came in the last week for doing this. And Stephanie, you've actually had to reschedule a whole variety of calls for us. Actually, Jordi had to as well. And we really appreciate that. Also helping us bridge this conversation forward, finding the common ground. The work that you guys do at SFL and at LICOP is just so important in bringing this forward. Having said that, we need to talk about the uncomfortable issues of whether or not the voluntary approach for what we're paying is the right way forward. And I really hope that we can look back at this in about 10 years' time and say, there was a change. And I think that we've seen that change in the last year or two starting to happen, but we're nowhere near implementing that change yet. People are starting to slowly acknowledge that maybe we need to do it differently. And we will keep banging that drum from the outside, and we'll be working with people that are banging that drum from the inside. But we will come to a point in the cocoa sector where we realize that actually what we pay is not up to some kind of anonymous hand in the sky, but is actually up to the hands of the people in procurement divisions that say, are we paying the right price? And I think that that is a place that we are going to come to, and we hope to contribute to that. So thank you all so much. And the last words are thank you to my wonderful colleague, Claire, who has done so much to make this possible as well. So thank you very much, Claire. Thank you all. And Please get in touch with us if there are things in the paper that you violently disagree with or have great examples of why it's a great idea and everything in between. And if you are in the broader civil society or farmer-based network and planning to come to Amsterdam in February for the Cocoa Week, please join us on the 5th of February for the Farmers and Civil Society gathering that we're organizing then. Thank you all so much and have a great day, morning, afternoon, evening, depending on which part of the world you're dialing in from. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.